If now as well. Okay. And I'm just going to start it now. All right. Bye.
Right. Good evening, everybody. We're very delighted to have Ian Spencer with us once again, giving us his knowledge and wisdom on the question of why Marx. And tonight, he's going to be looking at why the UK has never produced a mass revolutionary Marxist party. He's also going to be looking at Marx and Engels and the British unions and the predecessors of the Labour Party, the ILP, the LRC, SDF, and Socialist League. So I'll say no more, but hand over to Ian.
Is that sharing? You see that?
Yep, we can see. Yeah, we can see your presentation.
That's it. Good evening, comrades. Those of you who have been absolutely enthralled at the Labour Party conference will enjoy the vision of lots of union flags and not much evidence of what we might call socialism. And of course, what we often find is about this time, lots of people on the left scream and shout about the betrayal of the Labour Party of any kind of idea around a socialist idea, or even a close relationship with the trade unions. What I'm going to suggest is that the Labour Party doesn't engage in a betrayal of socialism, but that it has never been socialist from its inception. In looking at the history of the Labour Party and its relationship to not only its own founders, but to Marx, Engels, Eleanor Marx, who played an important role, what we'll see is that, in fact, if anything, the British Labour movement has historically started off as the tail end, really, of the Liberal Party and of what one might call liberal radicalism. And the trajectory followed by the Labour Party, whether it's towards nationalisation rather than the common ownership of the means of production, is an intrinsic part of the early founders of the Labour Party. So the picture you see here is the famous picture taken of the Chartists meeting on Kennington Common in 1848. Frederick Engels, of course, was in London about this time, and as it were, caught the tail end of the of what had been a reawakening of the Chartist movement in 1848. And it's interesting as well that if you go through the collected works of Marx and Engels and look for references to the British trade union movement, it's quite often Engels that writes upon it, which is understandable. They had a kind of division of labour between them, where Marx was concentrating on economic studies and philosophy and so on. Engels, of course, as a factory manager in Manchester, had a great deal of contact with the British workers' movement from the other side of the fence, and also as a well-informed commentator and revolutionary. So in the condition of the working classes in England, Engels appears to be is pretty critical of the trade union movement in Britain. The trade union movement in Britain, having evolved, as it were, early on, arguably some of the craft unions were related to, had a historical background in guilds, and what Marx and Engels saw during the course of their lifetime was the development of a new unionism, general workers' unionism, which by the 1880s was producing significant differences in the old unions, as it were, that were rooted in the protection of craft union members' particular interests against competition. And so in 1845, in The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels says, but what gives these unions and their strikes arising from them their real importance is this: they are the first attempt of the workers to abolish competition, that is to say, competition among the working class for scarce jobs and later other services too. In the context of Britain in the 1840s, he doesn't have a high regard for those he regards as socialists or regarded themselves as socialists. Socialists, he says, are thoroughly tame and peaceable, accept our existing order, bad as it is, so far as to reject all other methods, but that of winning public opinion. And this then is the beginning of a theme which I would argue comes down to the present, the idea that somehow trade disputes are won by maintaining popular public support rather than by changing anything to do with the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. By 1888, 1889, and the Great Dock Strike, I mean, there's a good example there in the context of the dock workers in 1889. Before the strike, workers simply had to stand outside the docks in the hope of picking up some from casual labour as each day went by. And they were often the poorest in one of the poorest parts of London in the East End and around the docks. Many men were so hungry they could only work for a short period of time and take whatever pay they could in order to feed themselves. So under the leadership of Tom Mann, Ben Tillett and so on, and others who I'll come on to shortly, the dock strike was a great success and started to show the possibility of what trade unions could do in terms of not only winning gains for their members, but potentially posing a challenge to the ruling class itself. Marx has this to say in his essay, lecture really, on wages, price and profit. Wages, price and profit was delivered as a lecture to the First International, and it's an important piece of work, and it's a very useful starting point for those who want to read Capital. So at the end of one of the chapters, he says on the trade unions, instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. Just out of idle curiosity, I started to flick through some of the trade union websites before presenting this, and look at the Royal College of Nursing website, look at a whole range of different unions websites. The talk is of fair pay. Marx here is arguing for the abolition of the wages system, and most of the trade unions have in fact never done anything more than haggle over the price at which workers are exploited, rather than ever challenging the exploitation of the working class. And this was one of the principal divisions between Marx and Engels and some of the other members, for example, of the Social Democratic Federation, which I'll come on to in a moment. And one of the other great divisions, of course, was participation in Parliament. The Social Democratic Federation, originally founded as simply the Democratic Federation, it became the Social Democratic Federation in 1887. So founded in 1881, it had some interesting members. These are not the only ones, but I've taken a brief selection, just to give you an illustration of what the background was to one of the organisations which went on subsequently to make up part of the early Labour Party. Henry Hyndman, I'm going to talk about more in a moment, but it's fair to say at this stage that Marx detested Henry Hyndman on a personal level as well as a political one. He regarded him as little more than a kind of political chancer, as it were, whose sole interest was in gaining a place in Parliament for himself predominantly, and was entirely concerned with electoral politics to the exclusion of working with trade unions. Hyndman also annoyed Marx personally as he plagiarized his work. Hyndman, as we'll see, produced a number of books which lifted tracts, often distorted them and passed them off as his own work without any kind of reference to Marx whatsoever. James Connolly, I'm not going to talk a lot about because I want to come back to him more when we talk about syndicalism in a few weeks' time. However, most of you will, of course, know of James Connolly as the leader of the Easter Uprising in Dublin in 1916. But Connolly was briefly a member of the Social Democratic Federation and lots of other organisations as well. The reason why I'm going to talk about him in the context of syndicalism is that for a while he was in the United States and was a member of the International Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies. And he was an associate of Daniel de Leon. And in that context, I think it's worth talking about Connolly under syndicalism, although, of course, Connolly is a fairly complex figure and deserves a session on his own, which he has had in this group at different times when we were doing, for example, the lives of the left. Coming then on to Eleanor Marx, I'll mention her a bit here and then a bit more later. Eleanor Marx is typically known as Karl Marx's youngest daughter, but that overlooks her quite enormous contribution in her own right. She had a hand in translating Capital, Volume 1, along with her husband. They were never formally married, but her husband, Edward Aveling. And she made a number of other very important contributions, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And William Morris. William Morris today, of course, is largely thought of as a printmaker, the originator of lots of nice patterns of wallpaper and dress material for beloved of middle-class people everywhere. And a kind of leading figure in the arts and crafts movement. It's interesting that somebody who was politically radical, as it were, albeit in a rather strange way, was so conservative aesthetically. Most of his aesthetic work, most of his artistic works, were concerned with trying to reclaim as almost a golden age of the past, so a period looking back to the medieval period, looking back to the Elizabethan period, and trying to recreate old craft forms in opposition to the mass production that poor people had to put up with. William Morris himself was, as it were, on the left of the Social Democratic Federation, but that, in a sense, doesn't say a great deal, in that later on he tended to affiliate more with the anarchist side of the Socialist League, which split away from the Social Democratic Federation. George Lansbury was an interesting character because he was one of the few, in a sense, that we would have regarded himself perhaps as firmly on the left. He had he was for a brief period led the Labour Party after the period in which the Labour Party formed the national government in coalition with the Conservative Party in 1931, and he led the rump group of the Parliamentary Labour Party, while Herbert Morrison led the party as a whole. It was interesting in other ways. He supported the Russian Revolution. He opposed participation in the First World War. He was actively in favour of women's suffrage, and he represented a part of the left of the Labour Party, which is largely overlooked today. Tom Mann, some of you will know, was a leader along with Ben Tillett of the dock strike of 1889. And of all the people that Engels refers to, Tom Mann comes out as one that's held in higher regard, although Engels expresses his frustration that Tom Mann could get excited about the fact that he was going to be having dinner with the Lord Mayor on a particular day. So you see this frustration in Engels and Marx of the tendency on the part of the British Labour movement to be somewhat fawning towards members of authority, and the Social Democratic Federation as a whole were not particularly supported by Marx and Engels, largely because of the detestation of Henry Heinemann, to which I'll now turn. Heinemann himself occupies quite a lot of ire on the part of Marx and Engels. He himself was a conservative son of a wealthy businessman. He graduated from Trinity College, Cambridge. He was a very much a conservative figure. One might suggest that might say that there was an element of the kind of radical liberalism about him, but initially he became a socialist after reading a novel by Ferdinand Lassalle, and then subsequently the Manifesto of the Communist Party. England for All was a book he wrote in 1881, which widely plagiarized both the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and wrote a number of other books, which the interesting thing about them was that they were very popular, which annoyed Marx even more, I suspect. That along with people like Jules Guide, I mentioned last week in the context of the French Party, Heinemann had a capacity for popularizing stuff to a wide audience. But if you look at it carefully, it's often a bowdlerized version of Marx. It's a bowdlerized version of socialist ideas. And he was also a kind of admirer, for example, of Giuseppe Mazzini, who was an Italian nationalist, who, unlike Giuseppe Garibaldi, was fairly right-wing, really, and Mazzini famously opposed Marx in the context of the First International. By contrast, Giuseppe Garibaldi was a member of the First International Working Men's Association. Heinemann was also thoroughly anti-Semitic, exactly what one might call the socialism of fools, where he expressly kind of tended to refer to Jewish capital as if somehow that made capital somehow worse, the fact that it was Jewish capital. And he was also a pretty principled supporter of British imperialism. He had no interest whatsoever in the effect that the British Empire was having on peoples around the world. The left eventually split from the Social Democratic Federation to form the Socialist League. Among the many things that Henry Heinemann annoyed people by was that he actually took money from the Conservative Party to the tune of about 340 quid in order to found Social Democratic Federation candidates. And of course, the Conservatives' interest in this was absolutely crystal clear. They wanted Social Democratic Federation candidates to stand against liberals in areas where there would otherwise be a straight fight between Tories and liberals, and therefore allowing the Tories to win. And Heinemann took the money and fell for it, despite the fact that none of his candidates that he put up actually got more than, well, one candidate got a few hundred votes and the others got votes in their tens, and it was one of the many aspects which Marx saw in Heinemann an unprincipled opportunist, somebody who was only really interested in politics from the point of view of it being a career for him. His legacy, if he has one at all, is that the Socialist Party of Great Britain, which was founded in 1911, out of the kind of shattered remnants of the Social Democratic Federation, absolutely, even to this day, refuses to have a leader as such because of the pernicious effect of Henry Heinemann. He was regarded as being a kind of thoroughly dictatorial leader and wanted to run it as a kind of personal fiefdom, as it were. And so in 1884, the left split to form the Socialist League. And here you see the arts and crafts influence on the Socialist League. So some curious characters here that probably people, I mean, I had never heard of Ernest Belfort Bax until I went to university. And the only reason why I'd heard of Ernest Belfort Bax then was because one of my lecturers had done quite a lot of research and published a very expensive book on Ernest Belfort Bax. Ernest Belfort Bax was an interesting character insofar as he had gone to Germany in 1879 to study music, having come from a fairly well-off background. And obviously becoming fluent in German, became very interested in German philosophy. He didn't really succeed as a musician, but became one of the few intellectuals in the British left to have any kind of schooling in Hegel, Kant, and various others. But the interesting thing about it was that he wanted to have a kind of Hegelian socialism. He didn't want the materialism that Marx put forward. So once again, we see this recurring figure, this recurring feature in socialist parties, where a bowdlerized, stunted version of Marx was being presented in a populist way, and often in a way which was, to say the least, not really fully in accord with what Marx was arguing, as we'll go on to see, typically arguing in favor of cooperatives rather than the idea of the common ownership of the means of production, often arguing in favor of nationalization rather than the common ownership of the means of production, as if they were somehow the same thing. Returning then to William Morris, I mean, one of the things that was important about Morris was effectively he was bankrolling the Socialist League, the newspaper of the Socialist League, the Commonweal, which published a number of very influential articles. Eleanor Marx, for example, had a regular column in the Commonweal about the international socialist movement, which, of course, she was well versed in through her family, immersed in, indeed. William Morris did a lot to popularize socialist ideas, albeit not Marxist ideas. So Morris himself was part of the Socialist League that was adamantly opposed to the idea of engaging in political activity, involvement in politics and elections. And by contrast, Eleanor Marx, Edward Aveling, Tom Mann were all vehemently in favor of some kind of political representation for the working class, and of using parliamentary forms to promulgate socialism. Coming back to Eleanor Marx, for example, she was always known, all the Marx daughters, Jenny was known as Jennychen, because she was little Jenny, as it were. Actually, all the girls were called Jenny and some other name. Laura was known as Shushu, and Eleanor was known as Tussie. And the idea that she was just Mrs. Edward Aveling is also somewhat obscene. Her own contributions were enormous. Not only did she have a hand in translating Capital alongside Edward Aveling, but she also had a hand in translating Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and making that widely available. She also was quite an extraordinary linguist in her own right. She, unlike her father, embraced her Jewish heritage in no small part because out of solidarity with the Jewish proletarians that she encountered in the East End of London. For example, Eleanor Marx had a hand in the Bryant and May match girls strike. She had a hand in a demonstration in 1887, which became known as Bloody Sunday, which was concerned with the oppression in Ireland and also poverty in the UK as a whole, which was violently suppressed by the police in 1887. She had a hand in supporting the Great Dock Strike of 1889. She also, just as part of her interest in the fate of Jewish workers in East London, many of whom were working in sweaty trades in the rag trade and so on, she learned Yiddish. to the extent that she could actually give lectures in Yiddish. She taught herself Norwegian, as you do, because she also had an avid interest in drama. Now, I've heard one person say years and years ago was that all she really wanted to be was an actress. I'm not sure that's true. Yes, I think she would have liked to have been an actress, but her interest in dramatic art had a profound political content. It is said that when Marx was writing Capital, Tussie would be playing in the room as he said about his work, and Marx would often make up stories to explain what Capital was about to her. And even at an early age, even when even what we would regard as primary school age, Tussie would be able to recite Shakespeare, and did. So she was immersed in dramatic art from an early age, and it's often forgotten that Marx and Engels were both interested in poetry and loved Shakespeare and dramatic art and so on. She taught herself Norwegian so she could translate and perform the work of Henrik Ibsen in English, and she was the first person to translate The Enemy of the People into English. She also was in a reading, which didn't get a huge audience, of one of Henrik Ibsen's work, The Doll's House, and was in that alongside George Bernard Shaw and Edward Aveling. So for Eleanor Marx, who has her own formidable contribution to socialist action and ideas, it was as a translator and as someone who could draw the connection between art and literature and politics. Edward Aveling, another interesting character, again, in a sense, best known for his translation of Capital, Volume 1, along with Samuel Moore. I'm told that the Moore Aveling version is still the best translation, though many of you will have the Pelican edition, which is fine. But Moore Aveling, assisted by Eleanor Marx, translated Volume 1 Capital. Aveling himself was a curious polymath character. He trained as a doctor, but didn't finish the training completely and switched instead to kind of physiology and zoology, and gave lectures in science, and was a popularizer of science and popularizer of the work of Charles Darwin. Aveling actually met Karl Marx only once, when he was giving a lecture on flowers and insects, to which Marx and Eleanor Marx had attended, and he spoke very highly of Karl Marx, and it was from there that a relationship started. What a cracking night out that must have been! Flowers and Insects by Edward Aveling. Aveling, of course, is also known as the person who was really quite unpleasant. Eleanor Marx committed, you'll see that the year of their death is the same. Eleanor Marx committed suicide when she discovered that Edward Aveling had gone and married someone else, despite the fact that he'd been in a relationship with Eleanor Marx for many years. Eleanor Marx took her own life in 1898 at a time when you could buy a cyanide over the counter at the chemist's. A tragic loss to the workers' movement, if ever there was one. Thomas Mann, I've already mentioned in terms of his leading role in the context of the Great Dock Strike, along with Ben Tillett and others. However, by 1888, the Socialist League had really become dominated by anarchists, and William Morris himself had no interest whatsoever in pursuing a kind of political angle on the part of the Socialist League, and preferred instead the kind of anarchist route. It's not clear to me that Morris had really read very much of Marx at all, and was more influenced actually by the work of once again, Prince Peter Kropotkin, who we encountered when we looked at Marx and the anarchists. William Morris was a close associate of Peter Kropotkin when he was in London. So effectively, from the Socialist League, then the Marxists, such as there were, and as you see, there really weren't very many, resigned. And what we then move on to is what is the kind of origins of the Labour Party as a whole. Frederick Engels, interviewed in 1893, when asked about the Fabian Society, said of the Fabian Society, I take to be nothing more than a branch of the Liberal Party. And of course, this is a reflection of the fact that many of the people who were part of the Independent Labour Party, the Labour Representation Committee, and indeed the Fabian Society were at one time or other liberals. The history of the British trade union movement was a one of, as it were, tail-ending the Liberal Party, where, for example, there was a possibility. The first Labour MPs were elected often as liberals or as Labour liberals or liberal Labour people in seats where there was no Liberal candidate, and quite often the Liberal Party assigned potential seats for working people in areas where they had no hope of winning. And the Conservatives were fully aware of the possibility of Labour and the Liberals of splitting the vote and allowing the Conservative in. This is again a theme that we see today. And when Keir Starmer, no relation to Keir Hardie, was sprinkled with glitter, it was sprinkled with glitter. It was by somebody protesting about the election system, the idea. And so today, I can foresee very easily that the question will be, do you vote Labour or do you vote Tusk or some other group of people who will be standing on an explicitly Marxist position? I'm not going to say too much about all the others, except I'll come on a bit more to Ramsay MacDonald in a moment. But Sidney and Beatrice Webb were interesting. What Sidney Webb was briefly, I was astonished to read this, briefly the Member of Parliament for Seaham, which is very near where I live and where my mum grew up. But Sidney Webb was briefly a Member of Parliament for Seaham, and was later made Baron Parsfield. So Sidney and Beatrice Webb were Baron and Baroness Parsfield. Among their other contributions to society was that they established the London School of Economics, but they were resolutely liberals. They also had some fairly other unsavoury aspects to them. They were both convinced eugenicists, as was George Bernard Shaw, but eugenicists were kind of widespread at the time. And Francis Galton, who was the kind of leading proponent of eugenics in Britain at the time, was hugely influential and widely courted. And of course, it was Francis Galton who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. It wasn't Darwin. So H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, Ramsay MacDonald, Emmeline Pankhurst, these were all members of the Fabian Society. They weren't the founders of it, but most of the founders of it languish in obscurity. And the Fabian Society was one of the socialist societies that, and still to this day, is a socialist society which is affiliated to the Labour Party. And you can be, for example, the Fabian Society delegate to your local constituency Labour Party. Indeed, Margaret Hodge, when I was in Islington South and Finsbury Labour Party, Margaret Hodge was the Fabian Society delegate to Islington South and Finsbury constituency Labour Party. And I think that probably tells you as much as you need to know about the Fabian Society in the present. The coat of arms that you see there is a wolf in sheep's clothing. This was, believe it or not, an early attempt on the part of the Fabian Society to design for itself a coat of arms. Initially, well, now, I think they use the tortoise, the analogy being the tortoise and the hare, Sloan slow and steady wins the race, as it were. But here it's the wolf in sheep's clothing. Perhaps it might be best as a sheep in sheep's clothing. But the Fabian Society has always constituted that part of right-wing Labour that was, as Engels observed, really little more than a branch of the Liberal Party of its day. Fabian Society, by the way, from the Roman general Fabius, who in the Punic Wars used kind of guerrilla tactics to wear down Hannibal rather than a full frontal confrontation in the battlefield. This is James Keir Hardie. Keir Hardie was a liberal and really remained a radical liberal, but arguably moved to the left somewhat. Never really a Marxist. And here is Frederick Engels' appraisal of him. He's mentioned in a few places, but he was in 1879. He was a leader of the miners' union. And Engels says of the Independent Labour Party at the time, the Independent Labour Party is extremely indefinite in its tactics, and its leader, Keir Hardie, is a super cunning Scot whose demagogic tricks are not to be trusted for a moment. Engels here is really arguing that as somebody who had tail-ended the Liberal Party, had really little interest in the revolutionary transformation of society, but was instead committed to parliamentary action alone, in just the same way that Heinemann was, albeit a little bit less duplicitous. But anyway, in 1892, he became the Liberal MP for West Ham, which at the time was part of Essex, and is now, of course, a part of the London conurbation. And then by 1900, he was the Labour MP for Merthyr Tydfil, which he was for the last 15 years of his life. I know that Ramsay MacDonald was also in the Independent Labour Party, but I've included him here as part of the Labour Representation Committee. In preparing for this and combing through the Marx and Engels collected correspondence, I only found one reference to Ramsay MacDonald, and it was as the miserable MacDonald, in the context of his support for the Liberal Party in the context of a state visit of the Tsar of Russia to Britain. But James Ramsay MacDonald was a member of the National Liberal Club and the Fabian Society, making that point again. He's one of his great contributions, I suppose, if you think the coming to prominence of the Labour Party was a great project. In 1903, he was responsible for the pact between himself and Gladstone. This is not William Ewart Gladstone, but his son, where they effectively had a secret pact to not stand Liberal candidates against Labour candidates and vice versa. And as a consequence of that, in 1906, 29 Labour MPs were elected, and then later on, the Liberals were able to form a government effectively with Labour help. In the 1910 Liberal government, for example, was almost completely dependent upon a cohort of around 40 Labour MPs. As part of the background of this, the Communist Party of Great Britain was founded in 1920. And of course, James Ramsay MacDonald was completely opposed to it. And moreover, despite his opposition to World War I, his opposition to World War I, along with James Keir Hardie, by the way, was not on the basis of socialism, and this was a fratricidal war of workers against workers in the interests of imperialism, the kind of position that would have been taken, for example, by Willie Gallagher in Scotland. But instead, it was on the basis of a combination of pacifism and regarding the likelihood of the First World War of being an economic disaster for Britain, which indeed it was. After the First World War, Britain was transformed from being a creditor nation into a debtor nation. So opposed World War One, as did James Keir Hardie, as did others, by the way. Even Manny Shinwell opposed the British involvement in World War One. And Manny Shinwell, interestingly, took James Ramsay MacDonald's seat off him, which also happened to be in Seaham. The Seaham Harbour seems to have been a go-to place for a nice, safe seat for wannabe Labour careerists. So Ramsay MacDonald was Prime Minister from January to November 1924, and again in 1929 to 1935. In 1931, he formed a national government with the Conservatives. So the whole history of the Labour Party hasn't been a history of betrayal. It's been a history of being effectively an adjunct to the Liberal Party, which has subsequently resumed power in the interest of itself. And the whole question about the relationship, for example, between the parliamentary Labour Party and the actual membership of the Labour Party was as much an issue for James Ramsay MacDonald as it is today for those who think that a terrible opportunity has been missed with the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn. And as an aside, I remember talking to my mum about all of this years ago, and as a child, she remembers the miners in Seaham trying to turn over James Ramsay MacDonald's car, and rightly so. And in conclusion, then, I'll leave you with this nice little quote that I found from Friedrich Engels to Georgy Plekhanov and of course we'll be talking about the Russian Marxists in a few weeks. In 1894, one is indeed driven to despair by these English workers with a sense of imaginary national superiority, with their essentially bourgeois ideas and viewpoints, with their practical narrow-mindedness, with a parliamentary corruption which has seriously infected the leaders. The only thing is that the practical English will be the last to arrive, but when they do arrive, their contribution will weigh quite heavy in the scale. Whether he's being over-ambitious in that last paragraph or whether we are indeed living in interesting times remains to be seen. Thank you very much, Comment.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating. Lots of lovely personal details. Yes, I'm trying. There we are, back again on video. That was really, really interesting. Fascinating stuff. About all the characters that were involved, but also the evolution of the Labour Party. I obviously will open now to comments and questions and contributions from the floor. So if anybody would like to ask a question or make a contribution, please would they raise their hand? And I can see Tina is raising her hand already. Okay, Tina, I will add Sarah.
Hello. My internet is a bit unstable. I hope it's good enough for this. Thank you very much, Ian. Very interesting opening. Firstly, Marx's daughter is called Tussie, not Tassie. it's pronounced Tussie, which has actually become a bit of a swear word. But anyway, not a proper swear word. It's more like a stupid Tussie type of thing. So it's not something you'd call your child today. You mentioned right at the beginning, and of course I agree, sort of the Labour Party, was never socialist, and people who claim, we need to reclaim it for socialism, etc., misunderstand the nature of it, and quite right too. I think it was a very mixed bag, as Lenin pointed out as well, and I just wondered if you agree with his definition of, that famous definition of a bourgeois workers' party, where you got the the trade unions and some of the socialist organizations signed up on the left, the workers' wing, as well as the bourgeois wing, the representatives of the bourgeoisie. If you think that is still correct, because we still have the affiliated unions, and that's still going on. And I would argue that still makes it a bourgeois workers' party. Yes, it has changed massively in the last few years. First, it changed dramatically, obviously, with Corbyn being elected, when the working class pole was very strong again. And then now it's being moved back to the bourgeois pole, a bit like it was perhaps under Tony Blair. So those who claim that, Starmer is evil personified, and I have to say, I find this Stop Starmer campaign very difficult. That they've written in their blurb, he's the most untrustworthy Labour politician, the most untrustworthy politician ever. Like, he's worse than Boris Johnson, he's worse than Tony Blair, who killed millions of people, based on a lie. He gave the go-ahead to go to war on Iraq based on a lie, and he knew it, and he's less bad than Starmer. Well, I think that's misunderstanding how the Labour Party has always worked. So it's being drawn back and forth. And of course, it is possible that it's been lost now to the working class. If the unions start disaffiliating, that would certainly make a big difference to it. And I'm not saying, join the Labour Party. I'm not saying stay and fight, etc. The window of fighting has closed quite some time ago. And most of us who spoke up have been expelled a long time ago. But, it was always between left and right. It's not a qualitative difference at all, what's been happening recently. It's going almost back to, where it was many, many times before. And it's maybe might be pulled back again. Who knows? But it's nothing special what's happening at the moment. I was going to mention, though, I was going to ask you a question also about Clause 4, or not a question so much as but bring it up, because that's almost what I know the Fabians are most famous for having written the clauses of membership in 1918. What we are, what the Labour Party is, and the most famous one is obviously Clause 4. And we've had a campaign recently by Socialist Appeal before they were chucked out, which was all about reclaiming that clause because it was so good and was so socialist, etc. And then you look at it and you think, really? I mean, the Fabians, obviously, they wrote it. And as you quite rightly point out, they were pro-imperialist. They were eugenicists, and not the good kind who say that, if you want to die, you should have the right to die. No, they wanted disabled people to be killed because they're a burden on society. They were anti-working class. They didn't believe that the working class could make a revolution, appealing to the bourgeoisie and middle class to understand how lovely socialism is and how good it is for them, being very patient and, not actually having a revolutionary outlook at all, on not even what, the working class didn't play a central role for them at all. Friedrich Engels was quite disdainful about them, called them, I think, middle class folk or something. They were pro-World War I, as I understand it, for a while. And coming out of that, obviously the Russian Revolution out of the World War I, and that led a lot of left-wingers into the Labour Party. The Labour Party became, was pulled to the left once again, as it does in its history. It was the Marxist influence, the influence of the Russian Revolution, which many supported at that time, was very strong. And as I understand it, the Clause 4 in particular was written as an anti-Marxist formulation. And if you look at we talked about the critique of the Gotha program a few times in between in the last few weeks. And Marx made a big point about this is Lassallean idea, as Ian mentions, we have to be a fair distribution and it'll be in the hands of the people, fairly distributed. Who decides what's fair? Who's that? What is fairness? What's justice? These are all very bourgeois concepts. It didn't talk about the means of production in workers' hands. It didn't talk about democracy. It didn't talk about expanding production. It didn't talk about people who can't work, etc. So it was all Marx railed against the Lassallean formulation in the Gotha program, which is almost identical to the one in clause 4. So the Fabians took from the Gotha program on purpose, they took from the critique of the Gotha, they took exactly that phrase that Marx was so critical of and put it in clause 4 as a, two fingers up to Marx. The Labour Party has nothing to do with Marx. We're not Marxists, we're anti-Marxists. And then you have 100 years, not even 100 years later, you have so-called Marxists fighting for the reinstatement of clause 4, which was written against Marxists. So it's a very strange history that we keep forgetting those kind of things. And, just because things sound nice, it sounds nice, doesn't it? Distributing fairly, etc. It doesn't mean anything, as Marx pointed out over and over again. You have to talk about who owns things, who controls things, and who's in charge, and not somebody somewhere distributing stuff. So I think that's quite an interesting critique of the Fabians, which goes to the heart of their terrible program. So I don't have a question as such on that issue, but the Bourgeois Workers' Party, I'd be interested to hear your view on that.
Well, it'll come as no surprise. I agree with you. What was so vile, really, about the Fabians, for example, was that in 1935, Sidney and Beatrice Webb published "Soviet Communism: A New Civilization?" ? Now, 1935, they were absolutely implacably opposed to the idea of Soviets, the idea of workers' councils taking power, the working class taking power for itself. But they were quite impressed with Comrade Stalin, as was George Bernard Shaw, who also quite liked Mussolini. Once we get to the point where genuine communists are being murdered in biblical proportions, Sidney and Beatrice Webb were in favour of Soviet civilization. The clause 4 is an interesting one. I mean, I can probably recite most of it from the top of my head. To secure for the workers. But hang on a minute. Contrast that with Marx and the liberation of the working classes, the act of the workers themselves. And the whole idea of Parliament being the means by which we have a slow, gradual, peaceful transition to socialism, usually defined in terms of nationalization rather than the common ownership of the means of production, rather than workers actually having their own industries in their own hands and managing society through direct participative democracy, was nowhere to be seen. Let's also remember some of the other contributions that Sidney and Beatrice Webb made, and this is important for people who get a bit dewy-eyed about the National Health Service as a glowing example of Fabian or Labour socialism. Sidney and Beatrice Webb were critics of the reform to the Poor Law in 1909. People often forget that before the National Health Service, there was another National Health Service, and it was the Poor Law infirmaries. There were the Poor Law infirmaries and the asylums, and they were largely administered through the rates. So local taxation was used to pay for the local hospital, or the local taxation was used to pay for the county asylum. And this was part of the National Health Service that existed before the National Health Service. And these were hospitals that are only used for the poor, really. The rich wouldn't go anywhere near them. Rich people were cared for by domestic servants at home. Why would they go into nasty, dirty hospitals full of fleas and whatever? What you have in the National Health Service is exactly what you tend to see in all of those progenitors of the Labour Party, a call for nationalisation, the state control of things rather than the common ownership of the means of production and the full democratic control. So clause 4, to secure for the workers by hand or brain and so on, was about the nationalisation and rationalisation of the Poor Law, for example. So the National Health Service, when it came into being, was just that. It was the Poor Law institutions, the asylums, the charitable hospitals, which were already failing because of the demands placed upon them in the aftermath, particularly of World War II. They were already effectively de facto nationalised during World War I because someone had to pay for all those wounded soldiers. and William Beveridge, for example, sometimes credited with being the architect of the welfare state, was of course a liberal. And so we see a continuity between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party. The fact that the Labour Party dissolved, the Liberal Party dissolved into a kind of rump for many years, and plays a kind of just a kind of protest vote role, it tells all you need to know. Effectively, the Labour Party is what the Liberal Party used to be. So yeah, I mean, the eugenics was pretty popular. I think somebody made a reference to Mary Stopes as well. I mean, Mary Stopes was another eugenicist who, I mean, she wanted women to be able to control their own fertility, which is right and proper, but mainly because she didn't want working class people reproducing. She wanted only nice people, and people who didn't wear glasses. She actually fell out with her son because he came home with some woman who wore glasses because she was imperfect. Anyway, the whole history of the Labour Party is a history of opposition to socialism, and it's now with regard to Lenin, of course. Lenin had no illusions about MacDonald and Henderson and all these other characters, and says so, and famously says, because there was the whole campaign when the foundation of the Communist Party of Great Britain was can it affiliate to the Labour Party, and Lenin, of course, urged them to affiliate to the Labour Party and support the Labour Party as a rope supports a hanged man. The question is why has the whole British Labour movement been irredeemably bourgeois? Why has there never been a mass revolutionary political party? And my suggestion is it's imperialism. And just as the whole of the Second International was implacably indifferent, you can be implacably indifferent to the idea of freedom for colonies and doing anything about racism or anything else, you don't see any of that in the Labour Party. And as we know, the Labour Party played a vile role in terms of British imperial policy. Just to take one small thing, in 1945, the Labour government, everybody gets very dewy-eyed about. Clement Attlee had no qualms about Lord Louis Mountbatten, then Supreme Allied Commander of East Asia and well-known nonce, of rearming the Japanese prisoners of war to make sure that the French got their colonies back. And therefore, the Labour Party had a hand in beginning the Vietnam War. And of course, Attlee also took us into the Korean War. So in terms of British imperialism and so on, the history of the Labour Party isn't a glowing one. Yes, it's a bourgeois workers' party. It's the capitalist.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. That was extremely detailed and again fascinating reply. And thanks, Tina, for all those wonderful questions. I'm going to go to Victor now. Victor, could you put your video on so that I can spotlight you, Victor? Victor, okay, we've got no Victor there. William O'Brien. We'll bring you in now to ask your question.
Aye. Well, the British Labour Party, as far as we are concerned in Ireland, is a pro-imperialist party. It never actually helped Ireland in any way whatsoever. As a matter of fact, every opportunity it got, it went against Ireland. It even supported the execution of the 1916 leaders. It scurrilized Connolly. And then in more recent times, it actually done away with political status in Northern Ireland. That was Merlin Rees done away with that. Then the worst Secretary of State we ever had in Northern Ireland was a so-called left-wing Labour MP called what's his name? The fellow who was a miner.
Dennis Skinner?
Who?
You mean Dennis Skinner?
No, Dennis Skinner was never Secretary of State.
Oh,
The other fella, I can see him now, and his name doesn't come to me. But anyway, he's you can see him walking on the video, on the YouTube video to the fields across Midland with the parachute regiment, giving our boys a bit of a boost, and then giving out because the IRA was shooting them, depleting the vote for the Labour Party. What does he expect? And he was a left-wing Labour MP, Mason, Roy Mason, right? He was ruthless. Now, if anything, the Tories secretaries of state were not half as hard on Ireland. As for the history of the Labour Party in Ireland, is not very much so. James Connolly did found it in 1912 after the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, or it was probably called the Congress of Irish Unions, had their conference in Tipperary, and that's when they formed a political party. Connolly wasn't that keen on parliamentary participation anyway. As you said yourself, he was a syndicalist, and he got his politics mainly from America, with the industrial workers of the world. The other opposition to him was a fellow called William Walker. Now, William Walker was the vice chairman of the Independent Labour Party, totally opposed to an Irishman, totally opposed to Irish independence, and was a white supremacist. He felt that the British Empire was a progressive thing because it was bringing savages into the modern world. That's savages being indigenous people in Africa. And that's what he thought. Now, Connolly totally and absolutely opposed him. The Labour Party has been a party of imperialism from a backward working class, as far as we're concerned, a backward working class in Britain. And I know because I was brought up in Britain, I was brought up in Birmingham. I went there when I was 9. I left when I was 17. That's the first opportunity I got. I left it. And there was hardly a day gone back that I wasn't called some kind of an Irish bastard or some sort of it. It was unreal and I was thick because I was Irish. Like, it was unreal. Now, I was thinking that if you want to really understand Ireland, and if you want to understand the British working class, you read Engels as opposed to Marx, because Engels lived with an Irish woman, and she was from the travelling community, and he had a great insight into the conditions of Ireland and the conditions of the English working class, which at the time were mainly immigrants from Ireland, especially in the linen industries and the textile industries in Lancashire, where he had his factory. It was a woman called Bourne, but some people say she wasn't Irish because she didn't spell her name the way we spell it. We spell Bourne with a Y. But the thing is, she didn't spell her name at all because she was illiterate. That doesn't mean she was stupid. It's just that literacy wasn't universal at the time, and she had no formal education. Now, when she died, he actually went to live, he cohabited then with her sister. And I seen a letter in the British Museum where Marx nearly lost his sponsorship because he insulted the woman. He said Marx was an alcoholic, of course, and a drinking alcoholic. And he sent a letter to Engels saying, you have to, one of your dirty Irish bitches died, and you're taking another one. And that was to that effect. And of course, Engels said, insult the women I love. You won't be getting any more money off me. So Marx put pen to paper very quick and apologized. That sort of thing is not known, but it should be known. Now,
William, I
You
do
know-
have quite a few other people who'd like to come in.
Okay, I just want to say about what we're
Yeah.
saying. This fella Keir Starmer, we have absolute faith for him. He is going to be the worst British Prime Minister for Ireland since Lloyd George himself. He's an absolute disgusting unionist of the worst type. And we know what's going to happen. He is going to be ruthless when it comes to Ireland. And the Irish are going to take up arms again. And you're going to have another round of Irish nationalist patriotism, which we want to avoid if we can. But we won't be able to avoid it because he won't allow it. We're going to have, Starmer is going to, he's already doing it. He's already said he will not honour the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the Irish have fought periodically, at least 3 times in the last century and in this century, and they will fight again if they have to. And that man is like, the Tories even have more common sense when it comes to Ireland. Like Sunak gave them the best deal they could get, the Unionists in the North. They could stay in the EU and they get the benefits of being out of the EU at the same time. They didn't accept it, and they won't walk the Good Friday Agreement.
William, could you please round up now? Please, can you wind down now? I have other people.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, William.
Okay.
I'm going to bring in Pamela Blakelock. Ian, would you like me to bring in a few people and then
Yeah,
come
bring a
back?
few. Yeah, I've got. Yeah.
I'm going to bring in Pamela now. Pamela Blakelock.
Hi, everyone. Hello, Paul. Yeah, so it was really a continuation of what has been put forward. So I've been arguing in my CLP that Labour has always been much more a bourgeois party than supporting the workers. And the evidence I was given of their pro-imperialism was the role in India, the fight against the Mau Mau, Ireland, of course, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Israel, pro-Zionism. And I just wondered if, it's worth going over some of the other appalling pro-imperialist and anti-colonial freedom struggles. I mean, I assume particularly in Africa, I'm thinking about maybe Zimbabwe and South Africa. Anyway, I think, the whole history is of pro-imperialism and anti-colonial struggles. And I just wondered if you could go into a bit more detail. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pamela. I've got Conchita.
Everybody, I'm feeling really bad because of what's happening on the news all this week, really bad. But anyway, one connection is I would be interested to know about people like Moses Montefiore. I have a sort of indirect connection in that I know that the portrait gallery in Trafalgar Square, the original idea of it being put together was through the amazing paintings that Moses Montefiore collected, and he donated all his paintings when he died to the nation. And that was the sort of impetus for actually doing up what used to be a block of stables into eventually a portrait gallery, and with a lot of the foundation of his paintings, which before that had been housed in a sort of kind of house nearby. And this is Lady Montefiore's cookbook. It was published in 1846. This is a photocopy of it, which I managed to get because the Montefiores had a weekend house in Thanet, and I went to boarding school there. And I always was fascinated by the name because they were Sephardic Jews, and that's my Spanish connection. And I only got hold of this book about 4 days ago, and these were high society people. To be invited to their dinners and to be invited to their home was a special occasion for guests. And they were very much part of society. But looking through these cookery books is very traditional Jewish cooking. And it is amazing from the recipes, a lot of them I would be squirmish in, that you have a family that really built up their wealth in the UK before Zionism, in a sense, before Jewish Zionism. They had a connection to Zionism, but I would be very interested in knowing a history of Jewish people in London in particular, that their society and their participation in East End society, the way they lived, the way the community struggled together, and it was very much a very similar struggle to the Irish struggle in London. Because to me, from reading this book, it seems that the community was very poor, and yet something about them and their particular way of living in London created an amazing community before the Zionist ideas that we interpret now, that we know now, came about. And that's it. I cannot sort of, it is a question in my head that might bring some answers that are far more reassuring about perhaps the involvement of Jewish people in the development of the politics in the Levant, for example. I don't know. Today or this week, we're learning how many different interpretations we have of history and everything. Everybody has a different way of explaining it, of saying what's going on. So going back to the basic neighbors in our own community in London, and also I think there were also Jewish communities in the north of England, but they were very much, I think, part of the working class, and maybe those communities were separated, parallel separations, and we've lost a history of a sect of Jewish people we wouldn't know about. This is just an intuition. So that's my question. Is it, if anybody knows about that, is it worth studying in relation to Marx and Engels and socialism, and the socialism that I've got an instinct that this community had in London? That's all.
Yeah, I'll come back and take a few of those, if that's all right. I can't hear you, Carol. You're mute.
Would you like to come in now, Ian?
Yeah, I know nothing about the Montefiore family, I have to say. Simon Sebag Montefiore is a dodgy historian, as far as I can see, but I know nothing about them. The Jewish history of London is fascinating, and if you walk through East London, you will find vestiges of Huguenots, the Jewish community. There were different migrations into the UK. The Sephardic, all the Jews in Britain were murdered in 1290, murdered or forced to convert, and weren't allowed back until Cromwell. And most of those that came back from the 1650s through to the 18th century were Sephardic. and representations of Jews, for example, in the art of William Hogarth, doesn't tend to be very complimentary, but this is obviously a fairly well established group. Prior to 1290, they occupied a stratum within British society, and relatively high status. If you go to Lincoln, for example, just down the road from the cathedral, is a place called the Jews' House, and it's obviously a very nice place to have been. And before the massacre of 1290, the Jewish population were kind of co-partners alongside and came with the Norman invasion. Anyway, the Sephardic migration up to about the 18th century. From the late 18th century, early 19th century, then most of the Jewish immigrants were Ashkenazi, and from Central, escaping the pogroms. And the point about them was that they were left-wing. Very few of them had any interest whatsoever in Zionism, and Zionism had no purchase whatsoever in the context of the Jewish community in Britain or elsewhere until after the Second World War. Britain, the Labour Party in office did nothing. I think Ramsay MacDonald had some kind of hand in trying to change the appalling kind of 1922 Winston Churchill attitude towards Jewish migration to Palestine, because in the world of what was his name, Sir Anthony Storrs, to turn Palestine into a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a hostile sea of potentially hostile sea of Arabism. The aim was to create a settler state that would owe its allegiance to the British Empire. And one can see this in the writings of Abraham Leon and, of course, Nathan Weinstock, excellent book called Zionism, False Messiah. But look, 1948, Israel becomes an entity, and throughout the period of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, there has been effectively an affiliate of the Israeli Labour Party to the British Labour Party. It used to be called Poale Zion, but is now, it's changed its name, but it's still there. Effectively, the representatives of the Israeli Labour Party is affiliated to the British Labour Party, and has always exerted its influence. And Israel has always been a feature of initially British foreign policy intervention in the Middle East, whether it's been Tory or Labour, but of course after 1948, the Labour government tried to restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine, and therefore the Stern Gang and various other Zionist groups effectively fought the British state for independence for Israel, and including killing British service personnel and so on. I don't want to create the impression that there was no decent socialists whatsoever within the Labour Party. The ILP for quite a long time acted as a kind of ginger group within the Labour Party. George Orwell, for example, who fought in the Spanish Civil War, he fought alongside the PUM, Partido Obrero Unificación Marxistas, because they were affiliated to the Independent Labour, or the Independent Labour Party had fraternal links with the PUM, and so George Orwell, if you read Homage to Catalonia, he turned up in Barcelona and joined the PUM militia rather than the International Brigade, because he wasn't a member of the Communist Party. So, not everybody was in the Labour Party. It was completely dreadful, but the role of the Labour Party in international affairs and British imperialism and the involvement in the Middle East has been almost universally despicable.
Thank you very much, Ian. I've got some more people that want to come in. I'm going to bring Steve Freeman in now.
Well, there we go. I've unmuted myself. Hi, Ian. Thank you for that talk. It's getting me thinking about a few things. I was going to take up that point where you talked about the English working class being backward. Well, politically, I mean, I think backward politically is what it means, or conservative and then you spoke in that context of imperialism, quite rightly, of imperialism. But maybe that one day this whole thing, there would be a great, I wouldn't use the term great leap forward, but there would be a great leap forward. The English working class would leap forward in a great way and go from the back of the queue to the very front of the queue, become the vanguard one day, who knows? But that's an interpretation of that quote that you gave us. And I wanted to trace through, and I was thinking about that this imperialism, as you say, the symbol of imperialism very much was the monarchy, of course. And if you go back to the 19th century, before the period you're talking about, the dominant politics in the English working class was Republican. And you can see that strand in Chartism, right the way back to Tom Paine, right the way through to the 1870s, and the Land and Labour League, which had the paper Republic, which Marx was a member of the Land and Labour League. And then after in the 1870s, it declines, and that republicanism goes into the Democratic Federation. And then the Democratic Federation, it sort of slips out. When you get to the Social Democratic Federation, socialism has taken over, and that kind of Republican bit has kind of disappeared. So what you're really getting is, you're getting loyalism as the predominant. If we were going to talk about the Labour Party, we could call it bourgeois, and everybody's discussing whether it's bourgeois workers or all those other things. But in terms of culture, it's a loyalist party. It's the loyalist Labour Party, Her Majesty's Labour Party, His Majesty's Labour Party, a party that's loyal to the crown, because of course the crown, we're not just talking about the king in that sense. King's merely the symbol of the state. And so you have that current. Now, trying to trace through loyalist Labour, you can see if you look at clause 4, so-called radical, it's a loyalist clause because it doesn't have any republicanism in it whatsoever. It's going to nationalize everything, full stop. And quite significantly, Beatrice and Sidney Webb wrote, you mentioned them later on in the 30s and how they turned over to Stalinism, but they wrote a pamphlet called A Socialist Commonwealth, which I thought was a very good idea. But when I had a look at this book, they had a king in their socialist commonwealth because they couldn't conceive of having a country without a king, because that's so deeply embedded in our culture. So of course we're going to have a socialist commonwealth, and obviously we didn't need to mention it, but we can naturally assume it would have a king. And so but there is a republican tradition also hidden away in there. You can find it a little bit in Keir Hardie and George Lansbury, but obviously the most important one that you mentioned was James Connolly, who obviously therefore became the leader of the 1916 uprising and set up the Irish Socialist Republican Party. And you didn't mention in there, but I mean, we could mention everything, but the Socialist Labour Party, which was like the British Socialist Party, they all came out of, I think, the what was it? The SDF. They all came out of the SDF, right? The BSP. And in 1903, when the Socialist Labour Party of Connolly was set up, they had at their founding conference, they had a debate. What should we call the Socialist Labour Party? And the answer was the debate that they had was between whether we should call it the Socialist Labour Party or whether we should call it the Republican Socialist Party. Right? And of course, we know that the Socialist Labour Party won. And as you say, the reason it won, of course, because Connolly was in thrall more to Daniel de Leon, and Daniel de Leon, the syndicalist from America, their party was called the Socialist Labour Party. So they decided they would follow the de Leonite and gave it that name. But the name Republican Socialist Party was in effect where Connolly went eventually. He became a Republican Socialist in Ireland. And he played a leading role with the Citizens' Army in the 1916 uprising. So I think the Republican Socialist and Loyalist Labour are still two very important traditions hidden in all that if you were doing a tree, you know, you kind of did as a tree, really, but it's hidden in there, is that. And that's where obviously I'm kind of interested in tracing that through right the way down to today, of course.
Thank you very much, Steve. Ian, would you like me to bring somebody else in?
More, yeah, please.
Paul. Paul's been waiting a long time. Over to you, Paul.
You're mute, Paul.
Paul, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ian, for a very interesting and thoughtful contribution. It was good to listen to you again. I've got a question which is to do with the left that emerged at the time. I think out of the split in the I think the BSP, I think it was. I'm not sure of the actual detail, but I'm thinking of people like is it Sylvia Pankhurst or Emily Pankhurst, and I'm thinking of Guy Aldred up in Scotland, and I'm also thinking of Lenin's critique of that position. I'm just wondering if you could say some more about that. That's my first question. The second question is about one of their tactics, which was known as the Sinn Féin tactic, which you're probably aware of, which is a kind of positive abstentionism, that you would stand communists and socialists on a platform of exposing the undemocratic nature of parliament, so they wouldn't take their seats, but they would attempt to propagandize for workers' forms of democracy as opposed to bourgeois forms of democracy. That's how I understand the position, roughly. I might have distorted it. But yes, thanks again for your thoughts on the Labour Party and its origins. I think the Labour, my understanding is even the ILP, which you mentioned quite favorably, was hostile to Marxism. It certainly was hostile to John Maclean when he came back out of jail for his anti-war activities and tried to get his job back in the Scottish Labour College as teaching Marxism. He was told he couldn't. He had to give up his Marxist education and refused to do that, which says a lot of what happened to him subsequently. Yeah, and also I also liked your emphasis on the Webbs and the Fabians, and my understanding of the Webbs is that they were positivists, and as following Auguste Comte rather than anything to do with Marx or Engels, and the idea that which is also in John Stuart Mill's thinking as a liberal, that that there are these class interests which are lead to conflict between the ruling capitalist class and the working class, and the only ruling group that can see the general good and the common good for all of the nation is the intelligentsia, the scientists, the artists, and the intellectuals, and that informs their attachment to Stalin's Soviet Union. They saw that as being a realization of a positivist utopia.
Thank you very much, Paul. Ian, would you like me to bring in one other person?
Yeah, sure.
Yep, I've got Raymond to bring in.
Thanks, Chair. Getting back to the early socialist movement in Britain and how they were influenced by liberalism, and how the new socialist movement morphed from liberalism to what we know today. But I think there was an even more fundamental ideological input at play, and that was Christianity, with its messages of turn the other cheek, charity instead of solidarity. And I believe moving away from the use of violence when violence is required is a big weakness in revolutionary the revolutionary tradition. And the other one that Ian talked about was the role of syndicalism. And Tom Mann was probably one of the most famous syndicalists in Britain at the turn of the century. But he actually moved and became a founder member of the Communist Party. He moved away from syndicalism. Yet today we find that the union which he reorganised, the Amalgamated Engineering Union at the time, in 1923 became General Secretary. He reorganised it on the basis of democratic centralism. And it became one of the most revolutionary trade union organisations in Britain. I was a member at the time in the 60s and the 70s when it was spearheading the working class movement, challenging anti-trade union legislation, and was a real challenge to existing society in Britain. Yet today, we've moved backwards. We've got another leadership in that union now, Unite, which is out and out syndicalist. So, Ian, I'm asking you to sort of elaborate or expand on the role of Christianity in hindering the development of a revolutionary transition in the British working class movement, and why on earth are we moving back to the influence of syndicalism when we thought we'd done away with it in the 60s and the 70s?
Thank you very much, Raymond. I think Victor has at last overcome his problems. So Victor has the last hand up. Can I bring Victor in now? Ian, okay. I'm going to bring Victor in.
Good evening, comrades. I'm sorry that I've been having such problems with my gremlins and viruses. I was almost on the point of deciding that I'll perhaps best not contribute. But I think there are some interesting points that I could illuminate. Not least of all is the habit of us referring to something called a Labour Party. Maybe there was a Labour Party when you all joined it, but it's not a Labour Party now. It's no more a Labour Party now than if I bottle it up with urine and put it on a supermarket or an off-licence shelf, it would become a bottle of whiskey. It is now a Blairite Lino Party. Lino, Labour in name only. And I think we ought to be careful with our terminology, because careless terminology could deceive voters. And I think we should be too honest and too decent to want to participate in helping the likes of charlatans like Stormtrooper to con and deceive voters. Now, the topic that Tina raised as to whether Stormtrooper is or isn't a nastier piece of work than Mr. Blair is an interesting one. I would say that at this stage in their political cycle, if you compare this stage in Stormtrooper's life with that of Blair, Starmer is definitely the more obnoxious guy. Before he came to power, Blair could still pretend he was a mate of Arthur Scargill and somehow had vague socialist connections. At this stage, Stormtrooper has already knifed Corbyn in the back, and we know now that that was all an act and a scam, his socialism. So I would say that perhaps the Stop Starmer campaign are right in what they say. However, let's look to the future. And I think the future is rather bleak now. A Stormtrooper government looks almost inevitable. Big business is behind him. Mainstream media is behind him. The deep state is behind him. And that was more or less Boris Johnson's last words from the dispatch box as Prime Minister, though it didn't get reported in the Blairite Brainwashing Corporation. Now, when you joined the Labour Party, as you used to be able to call it, I'm sure it was possible to genuinely believe that the Labour Party had something
can you
to
please
do
be
with
winding up
working
now,
class.
Victor? Can you please be winding up now?
Of course, providing education, housing, etc. The current Blairite Party is destroying cheap housing, privatising the health service, has nothing to offer the working class, and is therefore relying on wealthy people for its support. And the majority of people who are working class who will eventually realise this. And therefore, we're going to face a dire choice as to whether Starmer decides to go for an authoritarian leadership state, or whether he continues to risk democracy. The danger being that with Starmer having successfully discredited the left, a democracy will veer to the right like it has done in Europe. There's some thoughts for you to consider. Sorry to have kept you so busy. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. I didn't see any actual questions for Ian there, but thank you very much.
Thank you all, comrades, all. There's a few things. Indeed, well, it's interesting to mention Lenin. And it's interesting to mention Lenin in the context of the British Labour Party. We've already mentioned the idea that Lenin's argument was in left-wing communism and infantile disorder that communists should effectively support the Labour Party. And in a sense, that has been used as the justification for decades of Marxist entryism into the Labour Party of one sort or another. We can debate till the cows come home whether that has been fruitful, or whether Marxists entering the Labour Party rather than organising as Marxists has simply helped keep the stinking corpse of social democracy above ground a bit longer than was absolutely necessary. When in Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, the people he attacks are Willie Gallagher in Scotland. He attacks Sylvia Pankhurst, then in East London. So you have Sylvia Pankhurst later went on to form a separate communist party, I forget what it's called, Revolutionary Workers' Party or something, and took a kind of abstentionist position with regard to working not only with the Labour Party, but with even with the Communist Party of Great Britain, because she rejected Lenin's perspective. Now, what I've tried to argue throughout is that all the parties of the Second International effectively, if you want to put it this way, betrayed the working class. All the parties of the Second International, one can name, give honourable mentions to people who didn't support, for example, participation in World War II, but they all did. And I would argue that that has to be explained. And it's not enough just to simply talk about the betrayal of leadership. Just in the same way, I don't think it's enough to talk about Starmer as being, you know, a bit like Blair, and therefore he's going to be dreadful. We know he's going to be dreadful. We know he is absolutely committed to the same trajectory that the Labour Party has been on through its entire history, is to make Britain and the world a safe place for capitalists to make profits in. And if that means killing millions to make sure that uppity foreigners don't want their own countries back, then that's exactly what he'll do. Now, coming back to Lenin and his support for the idea that the Communist Party should give a kind of conditional support to the Labour Party. The question is, did Lenin really understand just how bourgeois the parties of the Second International were? Over the years, I've been very familiar with the idea that the reason why we've never had socialism, the reason why we've not had a proper Marxist party, in a sense, is because of Stalinism on the one hand and social democracy on the other. And I think that's a perfectly fair and reasonable point. Stalinism and social democracy have been an impediment to the development of a world-class consciousness. However, imperialism predates that, and the awfulness of the Second International predates Stalinism. And of course, social democracy itself, in the form taken by, for example, Clause 4 of the Labour Party's constitution, was in fact itself partly a response to Stalinism, a way of directing the energy of the working class into electoral politics rather than revolutionary politics. At the same time, Stalinist parties, often taking money directly from the Soviet Union, intervened wherever and whenever possible to sabotage workers' movements. In the end, all the main official communist parties became agents of the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. Coming back to the question of Christian socialism, I don't know enough really to say why that would have been an impediment. My own feeling is that of itself, it wasn't particularly. So Tom Mann, for example, was a committed Christian. He was an Anglican, and yet one of the finest trade unionists going. There were other committed Christians who were very left-wing as well. Certainly Karl Marx never had any kind of problem with the idea of people having a religious faith. His own perspective on it, as you know, was rather that it was the heart of a heartless world, the sigh of the oppressed creature, and still saw it as, in a sense, the basis of a protest. But I don't really know enough to say, and I can't think of reasons. I mean, it's certainly the case, I think, that when people have said that the Labour Party owed more to Methodism than Marxism, they have a point, in the sense that there was a moral opposition to the worst aspects of capitalism. And from that point of view, that is an understandable kind of justification for a reformist perspective. And of course, the interesting thing came about after the Versailles Treaty, which was John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes, rather than Marx, provided a economic theoretical basis for an interventionist perspective for state so-called socialism. Not socialism, but a kind of state intervention, state social democracy, if you like. And Keynes effectively provided an economic justification in the way that bourgeois sociology provides an ideological justification. And Paul, you're right. Beatrice Webb was a sociologist, and a thoroughgoing Comtean at that. A thoroughgoing positivist at that. I think we should never forget that as communists, we have always been in the vanguard of people demanding reforms, in no small part because we're on the side of the working class. And I, for example, particularly given my daughter's got cystic fibrosis, would defend with my dying breath the right to free medicine. But let's do it in the context of what a socialist society would be like. It wouldn't be just simply the nationalizing the hospitals and organizing in such a way that it effectively simply provides a guaranteed market for capitalist pharmaceutical industries. It would be one in which health would become a top priority for all, and free social care. I can predict exactly what's going to happen with the next Labour government, with regard to health and social care. Doctors will still continue to be badly paid. Why? Because that will mean they will leave the NHS, and the path to the full privatisation of healthcare will follow the model of dentistry. Try getting an NHS dentist now. It's not worth their while to work in the NHS, and the same will go for medicine. Try getting social care for an elderly relative with Alzheimer's disease. It'll cost you the house, if not more besides. And we're going to see this continued movement. And from that point of view, I'm not pessimistic. Ironically, I'm more optimistic, because what we don't have anymore is the Stalinism and social democracy, which we had to fight all along. The numbers of people who have been genuine Marxists over the last 70 years has been very few. One can't include the Communist Party of Britain, for example, which is just effectively the kind of sets itself up as the conscience of a thoroughly corrupt trade union leadership, and trade unions which have become little more than specialist adjuncts of human resources departments. So we're in favour of reforms, but reforms that are part of a trajectory towards the radical reconstitution of society at large. And if we take, for example, the Middle East, instead of the support for Zionist agents of imperialism in the Middle East, we would be in favor of a socialist federation of the Middle East, where all working people would have an equal standing. So I'm not pessimistic. Have I missed anything out? I don't think so. John McClane briefly. Yes, honorary consul of the Soviet Union, yet ironically didn't join the Communist Party of Great Britain and retained a kind of Scottish socialist perspective. One has to salute the courage of the man and his persistence in providing a Marxist education, come what may. But we shouldn't deify them either. And just the same way with James Connolly, enormous respect to a man of great courage and determination, and the best of his generation, which is why it was a bloody damn shame he threw in his lot with nationalists and paid the ultimate price for it. But we'll look at him a bit more when we look at syndicalism. Thank you, comrades. I've enjoyed all the contributions from the floor, and I hope I haven't bored you too much. Thank you. Good night.
Not at all, Ian. Absolutely fascinating. And great questions and great answers to them. Thank you so much, Ian, for presenting tonight and leading the discussion. We just wish everyone a very good rest of your evening. Goodbye.